Chapter 9. Now listen carefully. When all the sheets had been collected, Miss Tarango stood up from her desk and moved to the front of the class. Right, now for this activity I need someone who's strong-willed and brave, because he will need to meet the challenge of tackling the power of language. Have I got any takers? I glanced around the room. A few boys put their hands up. Barry Bagsley and his friends weren't among them. Neither was I. This was definitely a time to be a small target. A few brave souls, but what about the rest of you? Hope I haven't scared you off. Mr. Rango's eyes swept over the room like searchlights after escaped prisoners. I studied the surface of my desk intently. What about you, Ishmael? You look like you can handle the pressure. I shook my head and smiled weakly. He won't do it, he's gutless. Well, I don't seem to remember seeing you volunteering, Barry, but perhaps I should explain the task a little more. With that, Miss Tarango pulled the seat from the teacher's desk and set it up in the centre of the front platform. Whoever volunteers will have to sit on this chair. His task will be to stay on the chair. My task is to get him off the chair using only the power of language. A general discussion boiled around the room. Miss Tarango continued. I'm not allowed to order him off, threaten him, hit him, push him, or come in contact with him in any way. But before I walk around the chair 3 times, I guarantee he will no longer be occupying it. Now the class exploded into a rabble of disbelief, accusations, and questions. No way, miss. She's probably got a pin hidden somewhere. Can you tie yourself to the chair? Miss Tarango closed her eyes and held up her hands. Boys, I've laid down the rules clearly. The time for talk is over. So, who's willing to take me on? The reply was loud and immediate. I'll do it. Barry, Miss Tarango looked concerned. I don't know if this is really your sort of thing, and besides, other boys volunteered before you. They won't mind. Coming from Barry Bagsley, this is more an order than an option. Well, let's just check, shall we? Does anyone else want to volunteer? We can draw a name out of a hat. Silence. Barry Bagsley, as always, got his way. Mr. Rango appeared just a little flustered. All right, Barry, I seem to have lost my other volunteers. Come out here then. Barry Bagsley ambled to the front of the room and stood beside the chair. Before you sit down, it's very important that I check a few things just as a precaution. Now, Barry, this is serious. Tell me, do you suffer from any condition like a weak heart, high blood pressure, or dizzy spells? Barry Bagsley rolled his eyes and shook his head, trying to scare me off won't work. I don't want to scare you off, Barry. I just want to be on the safe side. I just want you to know that if you don't wish to go through with this, you can return to your seat now, and no one will think any less of you. We all knew she was bluffing, of course. She was the teacher. She was responsible. She was a girl. For crying out loud, she wouldn't do anything dangerous, would she? Barry moved to the front of the chair. He looked out over the class, sneered, and sat down defiantly. Right, said Mr. Rango, voice suddenly as cold and expressionless as a prison guard's. As I said, I won't speak to you or make contact with you in any way, but before I walk around the chair 3 times, you will be off. You must face the front at all times. If you look behind you, the challenge is lost. Do you accept that? Barry Bagsley nodded his head, with a little less of his former arrogance. Miss Tarango continued as she were preparing Barry Bagsley for execution. This was no time for dimples. Now listen carefully, because this is the challenge. I'll start at this point here, she said, stepping in front of Barry Bagsley's knees. When I return to this point, that will be 1 circle, and so on. By the time the 3rd circle is completed, if you are still on the chair, you win. If, however, as will most definitely be the case, the 3rd circle is completed, and you and the chair have parted company, then I win. Are you ready to begin? What prize do I get when I win? If you win, Barry, Mr. Rango said happily, you can have the rest of the day off. The room bubbled as if someone had just turned the air jets on in a spa. What? She couldn't do that. You can't just let people go home. Only the principal, Brother Jerome, could do that. Why would she be saying something so ridiculous as that? She's mad. Unless, of course, she knew that she couldn't lose. Tell you what, Barry, Mr. Rango smiled sweetly. I'm feeling generous. If you win, why don't you take the rest of the week off? The spa was switched to turbo. Boys, thank you, quieten down now. What's all the hubbub about? Thank you. Now, Barry, are you ready to rock and roll? I'm ready, said Barry Bagsley with a forced smile as his fingers tightened around the arms of the chair. Mr. Rango surveyed the area around the chair. She frowned and shook her head slightly. A strange silence settled the room. Can you boys in front row just move your desk back a little? Bit more. Yep, that should do. But I usually like more space. We'll just have to hope for the best. Let's get started. With that, Miss Rango walked slowly in a clockwise direction until she was standing behind the chair. There she stopped and looked down at her hands. Couldn't see exactly what she was looking at because Barry Bagsley was in the way. Mr. Rango stood absolutely still for a few seconds before completing the first circle. That's one, she said flatly. Getting worried now, miss? You going to lose your bet? Mr. Rango continued as if Barry Bagsley hadn't spoken and didn't exist. Her breathing had become noticeably deeper and slower. She moved around the chair for a second time. Again she stopped and glanced down towards her hands. Then she completed the second circle. That's two. I looked at Barry Bagsley's face. It was set hard, and he gripped the chair as if it were rocketing towards the loop of a roller coaster. There was no way that he would leave that chair. Mr. Rango was doomed to fail. What was she thinking? She glanced nervously at the front row of desks and muttered something about workplace health and safety. The boys were automatically edged further back. She stepped behind Barry Bagsley and began writing on the board. For a moment, only the soft squeaking and tapping of a whiteboard marker filled the room, as the entire class peered past Barry Bagsley's head to the words being formed in Mr. Rango's neat, even handwriting. Barry Bagsley's eyes danced and swiveled in their sockets as if any minute they would spin around like cymbals in a poker machine and reappear at the back of his head. Eyes to the front, Mr. Rango said coolly as Barry Bagsley's head began to turn slightly behind her back. Mr. Rango finished writing and stepped a little to the side. We all read what she had written. We all frowned. Then Mr. Rango stood directly behind Barry Bagsley. She had only one half circle to complete. She looked once again to her hidden hands. She slowly raised her left arm into the air. Barry Bagsley watched mesmerized while all the eyes in the class moved to a point just above his head. The boys in the front row sat with mouths gaping, like the row of clowns in Sideshow Alley. Behind Barry Bagsley, Mr. Rango had the cold stare of the Terminator as her fingers closed into a fist. We knew she was bluffing, of course, but then again, maybe she realized Barry Bagsley had beat her. Maybe she was desperate now and didn't know what she was doing. Maybe she was fake. What did we really know about her anyway? She could be a totally insane lunatic who had escaped from an asylum and was just pretending to be a teacher. Mr. Rango's fist hovered over Barry Bagsley's head. She took a deep breath. She seemed to be expanding so that her slight frame towered over the rigid form seated below her. Her eyes drifted up from Barry Bagsley's head to her fist. I held my breath, not knowing if I wanted her to do it or not. Then when the tension was almost unbearable, Mr. Rango rotated her wrist, looked at her watch, and turned to the class with a radiant, double-dimpled smile. When the end of lesson bell blared through the intercom, the whole class was jolted, as if they had been struck with electric cattle prods. Some boys gasped out loud. I was one of the gaspers. Bill Kingsley let out a squeal that would have been right at home in the night of the living dead. Even Barry Bagsley flinched, but he didn't budge from his seat. Suddenly, Miss Tarango was her old self again. Well, boys, we're all out of time, so we'll have to continue this tomorrow. Don't forget your English text for next lesson and your workbooks. Now pack up quickly, Anne. But she was drowned out by a howl of objections. Mr. Tarango looked bewildered. What's the problem? Barry Bagsley broke in rudely. You haven't finished the last circle. You have to finish the third circle, and then I win. You can't pike out now. But it's lunchtime, Barry. I don't want to hold up the rest of the class. We can do it tomorrow, perhaps another day. Good morning, everyone. Barry Bagsley looked astounded. What am I supposed to do? He whined. Sit here all night? Mr. Tarango smiled pleasantly. Well, yes, Barry, I suppose you do, because that was the challenge you accepted. If you don't believe me, it's right here on the board. You can turn around now and have a look if you want to. Barry Bagsley swiveled around but maintained his grip on the arms of the chair. On the board was what Miss Tarango had written a few minutes ago. Before I walk around the chair 3 times, you will be off. You see, Barry, this is the key word here, she said, cheerfully underlining the word before heavily. Now, my part of the deal was to walk around the chair 3 times. I didn't say how long I would take to do that, or when it would be completed. And maybe I'll do it tomorrow. Maybe the next day, the day after that. Maybe next year. Who knows? And naturally, if you're still on the chair at that time, then you win. I promise you though, one day before I die, I will complete that last circle. Because, as I said, that's my part of the deal. Then Mr. Tarango leant in close to Barry Bagsley and looked him right in the eyes. Now, your part of the deal is to stay on that seat until I do. A groundswell of realization rumbled around the class like a Mexican wave. When even Bill Kingsley's face eventually lit up in a rare display of comprehension, Barry Bagsley knew he was beaten. You see how powerful language can be, boys? Even a little word like before can hurt you, even if you don't treat it with respect and listen carefully. Now, before we all head off for lunch, let's give Barry here a big round of applause for having the courage to volunteer today and help with the demonstration. Cheer and jeers mixed with laughter and clapping as everyone spilled noisily from the room. Miss Tarango had won more than just a challenge. She had won over the class. All except for Barry Bagsley, of course. He sat glowering in the teacher's seat while everyone filed out so that no one would see his unavoidable surrender. Here are 5 amazing facts about Miss Tarango. Her dimples are deadly weapons. Her smile is hotter than a laser beam. She can make poetry sound exciting. She's not afraid of Barry Bagsley. She's definitely no Barbie bimbo. Supplementary amazing fact. After just one day, I knew she would be the best teacher that I ever had.